was a city girl growing up, and I grew up here in Toronto with parents who are refugees and immigrants, and I had no knowledge of the natural world. And when I went to university, I was placed in a lab that studied bees. And I remember we were sitting with this potential supervisor, my future supervisor, and we were at a picnic table, and we were just getting, the yellow jacket wasps coming at us trying to eat our sandwiches. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of bees here. And he just looked at me as this new person in his lab who didn't know the difference between bees and wasps, who's now going to be running research for him. It's kind of humbling to know that you can come from knowing almost nothing about a topic to becoming an expert on it in relatively few years, especially if you study insects, because so few people study them and there's a lot to learn. But also that even as scientists, we're constantly learning. So I got this job, and I had to do research in cages with bumblebees, like psychology-type behavioral experiments. So not only did I get to know what bumblebees were, but I had to get very comfortable because I was scared of bees and wasps. I wasn't their friend, but I had to get right up in there and feed them. So I was in a cage with 20 bees flying around, and I was feeding them as they were going to flowers. So I was very close, within inches. And that kind of gave me the confidence to work on bees and to get over my fear that I guess I learned throughout my childhood and teenage years. So after doing that work in my undergraduate research, I realized that no one was studying the conservation of wild bees in Canada at the time, which sounds kind of ridiculous now because it seems like there's a newspaper story on bee declines almost every day. So I went to Lawrence Packer, who was a professor, and I asked him if I could do my PhD to think about and to research whether bees were in decline, specifically bumblebees. I had done a few surveys, and I'd noticed that there was a species that was supposed to be there that I couldn't find. And when I started my PhD, that's when colony collapse disorder hit in the US. So honey beekeepers got hit with this new disease, and then all of a sudden there was this New York Times article, and all of a sudden bee collapse became one of the most important environmental issues of our time. And that was, I think, in 2006 or so, 2005, 2006. And I keep waiting for it to die down, but it seems to still be a really important issue, which is interesting for conservationists. I have a lot of collaborators who work on different types of conservation, birds and fish and grass, I guess. But there aren't too many topics where you have such intense political will and public interest. People just love bees. And I spent a lot of time surveying for bumblebees, and what I found with collaborators is that about a third of our native bumblebee species are at risk of extinction. So in Canada, you probably don't know this, but we have 855 species of native bees. Most people can name like 2 or 3, but we have 855. We have 42 species of bumblebees, but the focus really has been on honeybees in the media. So when we talk about misinformation and fake news, one of the things that has kind of defined the last, I'd say at least 5 years of my research is kind of going against a lot of the media and public knowledge. So it kind of feels like there's a lot of messaging that, bees are in decline. It's probably because of pesticides and it's all about honeybees. But the reality is it's quite complex. We have many species of native bees. They're not all declining for the same reason. In fact, 2/3 of them aren't in decline, at least for the bumblebees. So my research has really tried to figure out why some species are in decline and what we can do to help them. And what we've found so far for the bumblebees is one of the main threats is pathogen spillover from managed bees to wild bees. So disease transfer from managed bees to wild bees, which is so interesting to think about because a lot of kind of the people who are saving the bees here, Hollywood has been all over this, the way that people do that is to have managed bees in their backyards. So actually the solution that people have come up with sort of independently of conservationists is to actually make the problem worse. And that's been really challenging for me as a conservation biologist. Essentially what it's like is saying, I want to save the birds in this forest, let's throw in 100,000 turkeys. Or I want to save the fish in Lake Ontario, let's throw in 1 million Asian carp. it's really backwards when you think about it. And so trying to get that message out is something that I've really had to spend a lot of time doing, which is not exactly what I was trained to do, because my actual research was walking around in fields of flowers counting bumblebees. So if I want to conserve bumblebees, and I would argue that most of the general public is also interested in conserving bees, I need to figure out where some of this misinformation is coming from, and harness that interest that people have and try to educate them in a way that will actually move us towards having evidence-based conservation, essentially. So I've worked with the City of Toronto, and the City of Toronto pollinator strategy is one of the few that focuses on native pollinators instead of the European honeybee in North America. Well, what we realized was that you can conserve your native biodiversity, and in some ways it's actually cheaper than other ways, but it really does require these long-term partnerships. So I've been working with the people in the city for a long time. So when there was a city councillor who wanted to start this honeybee program in Toronto to save the bees, they knew who I was and they came to me, and we brought in a few other scientists that work on native bees to help put this together. And instead what we shifted the focus from saving honeybees to making sure that we're protecting as much native habitat in Toronto, to planting native plants, to minimizing some of the managed bees, to sort of downplay some of the threats that we know about, and to really appreciate the City of Toronto, which is where I grew up and knew nothing about bees, but to appreciate the fact that there are hundreds of species of native bees in the city, and in some ways, cities can provide refuges for biodiversity. In terms of climate change, we plant our flowers, we water them. If something dies, we replace them. So in a way, we're kind of perpetuating like some nice habitat, and everyone's kind of working together in that sense. Previously, there weren't a lot of honeybees in cities, so it was actually a refuge from diseases as well. Now, in the past 5 years, there have been a lot more managed honeybees brought into the city. And there's not a lot of pesticides used in cities either compared to agricultural areas. So in a way, our cities can be places where we really need to nurture our native bees. And in the sort of Southern Ontario region, we actually have over 300 species of native bees. So part of my work is really trying to get people to use citizen science programs. We have Bumblebee Watch, and to really start appreciating all this diversity that we have around us, because with climate change and other types of habitat loss and things that we're going to deal with in the future, it's really important that we maintain as much biodiversity as we can, specifically for bees, because they provide pollination of our food systems, our community gardens, and our natural and wild plants as well, which then feed things like birds and mammals and things like that. So they really are a really critical part of our ecosystem.
So what's a good, reliable intervention for people in urban settings to promote the habitat for wild bees?
There's two main things that people can do to help bees, especially in cities. Planting native habitat, so native flowers to your region, particularly focusing on the things that bloom early in the spring and late in the fall, because people like flowers in the summertime, but we always forget these shoulder seasons, which is where our bees are really short on food. And then the second thing is participating in citizen science. So we run Bumblebee Watch, and all of the recent records of the endangered rusty patch bumblebee have actually been given to us through a citizen science website. Instead of me driving around, as I did in my PhD work, where I was looking for a species that was quite common, and I only found 2 individuals in 10 years. But through Bumblebee Watch, with people having more eyes and covering more landscape, I think we have over 20 records of the same species from a few states. So really, participating in science in that way has been extremely beneficial.
Have you found that with the increase of managed bees that there are more issues with our native bees now in the city in Toronto?
It's something that we're studying. I have a student working on that right now, but there have been quite a few recent studies that show that honeybee competition is a problem. There was a study done by Kane and Tepedino a couple years ago now that showed that a single apiary took as much pollen away as 3 million native solitary bees, which is a huge number. It was pretty shocking. And then there have been more recently studies showing that diseases from honeybees are being transmitted to wild bees as well. So it's definitely a threat. And a lot of the people that bring honeybee hives out into land, they don't plant habitat to go along with it. So it's kind of intuitive that they're probably competing with our bees. Our largest bumblebee hives will have 200 individuals, but honeybee hives have like 50,000, and they make honey, which is storing food for the winter. All of our native bees sleep over the winter time. So honeybees take way more resources out from pollen and nectar than any of our native bees do. So we're trying to work on that now to try to figure out how much of that is impacting our native bees.
So I don't know much about managed bees, but what is it about managing bees that causes them to get diseases that then impact natural bees?
I think there are a few ways it happens. It's not entirely my field of research, but I can take a stab at it. We truck our honeybees for almond pollination in California, I believe in February. So like all of the hives, or most of the hives from the US, all go to this small area in California and pollinate. That's millions and millions of bees. And then they're all moved across to pollinate like apples in Michigan and that kind of thing. So you hear about these trucks falling over with like millions of bees. And so the potential for disease transfer is just astronomical. That would never happen in nature, where there's this many individuals moving across these large landscapes in these high densities. So in that sense, diseases are always rampant, and varroa mite levels right now are almost 100%. So really, beekeepers are just treating varroa mites, but pretty much all hives have some sort of disease. And then the other thing is some of the stocks, like some of the other species, they're kind of inbred. They don't have a lot of genetic diversity as well. So there's problems that are associated with that.
I read an article concerning dandelions and bees, and how that becomes bees' first source of food in the spring, and how pesticides and people getting rid of dandelions are affecting them. I was wondering if you came across that in your own research,
Yeah,
or
it's something people ask me all the time. I'm not on the Save the Dandelion boat. It's a non-native weed. It's better than asphalt or grass. So if those are your other two options, then fine, leave some dandelions for the bees. I'm a much bigger proponent of native wildflowers. Dandelions are probably quite important food for European honeybees. They've probably evolved in similar places or the same place. So they might be an important food for honeybees, which are awake over the winter. So they forage first thing in the spring, and there's something there for them. But dandelion pollen is quite poor in protein, and our native bees really need protein early in the spring. So the most important spring plants for our bees are probably like shrubs, eastern redbud, willow, pussy willow trees. There are a few things that have higher protein levels. Some of the apple, and there are a few other things that I would suggest over dandelion. But like I said, if the option is no flowers, then yeah, sure, save the dandelions.
Tell us about Toronto's official bee, because we have one.
Yes, and it's not a bumblebee. I did on the, there was that green metallic shiny bee, Agapostamon, I think it's Veracens is the species name. It's right over there. So when people start looking at bees, and this one particularly loves echinacea flowers, which a lot of people have in their garden. So if you start watching your echinacea flowers, you will find this green bee, because it's quite common. But people are always so shocked that bees are not just yellow, black, striped. We have green bees, we have blue bees, we have orange bees, we have red bees, and they're actually quite common. So you just have to start looking, including on the most common flowers. I'll also tell you that I also mentioned that none of our bees make honey because they all sleep over winter. Most of our bees cannot sting. Almost none of our bees live in hives other than bumblebees. So over 800 species of bees are like solitary. Most of them live in the ground in little holes. So a lot of the things that we've learned as children or as adults about bees is actually completely incorrect. They won't die after they sting you. That's another big one that I hear. Only honeybees do that. So there are a lot of misperceptions, and I think having Ontario's official bee as this green bee is a really good example of how we need to break some of these things that we've been taught and learn about bees.
Thank you so much, Sheila.